It's day 30 of the Karen Read trial. I'm going to give you part 2 of my daily recap. In part 1, I went over the recaps for Dr. Wolf and Dr. Sheridan, and we're going to get into the recap for Dr. Rentschler. He is an accident reconstructionist from ARCA, very well trained and studied. He has lots of experience. There's no doubt about that, and we heard all of that in the voir dire last Tuesday when the jury wasn't present. Alan Jackson wants to hammer in once again that he was not hired by the defense. He was not hired by the Commonwealth. He was hired by a third party. The defense could have called him, the prosecution could have called him, but the defense is the only side that decided to call him to the stand. Once again, Alan Jackson is getting right to the point. He says that the injury to the head, what you would expect with being hit by a vehicle at 24 miles per hour, and he says no. He goes into an explanation about it, and he says we had to look at exactly someone being configured to have the occipital region of the head be hit by the car without having any other injuries to the body. He reviewed all of John O'Keefe's autopsy information, and he knows that the injuries sustained caused no bruising or fractures, aside from just like very superficial things and the eye bruising that he had. He says if the head was just the only point of impact, you would have severe cervical injuries to the spine. We are moving on to the arm area, and Alan Jackson asks about are the same forces at play for the arm, and he says no. One arm weighs about the same amount as a head, which I didn't know. He has a whole formula for it, so it's about 10 pounds for a man of his size for the head and for one of his arms. He says based on his findings, the injuries to John O'Keefe were inconsistent with the taillight hitting his arm. Alan Jackson wants to know, was the head injury consistent with falling back and striking your head? And he says, yes, that could have been one of the ways to sustain that injury. But grass and dirt do not provide the same amount of force as concrete, which we've heard other people say too. Alan Jackson wants to figure out some hypotheticals and know what would the injuries be to John O'Keefe if his arm was hit by the car. And we've heard these theories with Dr. Sheridan, and he says contusions and possible fractures in the arm would definitely be present. For the cross-examination of Dr. Rentschler, the same kind of thing happens with Adam Lally. He wants to kind of chip away at his expertise. And did you cover all these facts? Did you know this point? Did you know this point? Nothing changes his findings. He says that if he was hit by the taillight, the pieces of the taillight would have impaled his arm. And we didn't see any of that in any of the autopsy photos. His wound looked really clean, actually, in the hospital when they showed his arm. So that's really something to think about. Adam Lally wants to know if he knew that there was DNA evidence from John O'Keefe on Karen Read's vehicle in the taillight area. And he says, a kind of smart-ass answer. It was interesting. He was like, but it wasn't any blood evidence, and it was just a small amount of DNA. So it kind of reminds the jury that maybe like there was just DNA there because she parked her car in John O'Keefe's garage. So that really reminded me too, is that they have reconstructed the whole taillight. We've seen the whole taillight put back together aside from just one small piece. And if it was cracked and in John O'Keefe's arm, there would be more pieces missing potentially. Or they would have taken pieces out of his arm. So then there would have been blood DNA on the taillight, and we don't have blood on the taillight. Adam Lally goes back into the hypotheticals about, did you know if the ground was frozen? And he says, we would have to do an analysis on the frozen ground, know the temperature to see how quickly the ground freezes. It's a really good response. It's another smart ass kind of one. So he says, we don't know what happened in this case, but it doesn't change my theories. The last question that Adam Lally asked, the answer really stuck out to me, so I made sure to write it down. But he says, this is not consistent with being hit by a car and ending up where he did. The damage is inconsistent with the injuries based on the ground being frozen or not. And then he has no further questions. The defense rests, and there's going to be no rebuttal for the case. Immediately after the defense rests, the judge lets the jury know you have heard all of the evidence that is to be provided in this case by the Commonwealth and by the defense. There's going to be nothing else. So Tuesday, the way that it's going to play out is that the defense is going to give their closing arguments. They will have about an hour to do so. Then the Commonwealth is going to give their closing. They will also have an hour to do so. And then the judge will do jury instructions. The alternates will be chosen, and then 12 of the jurors, I believe there's 15 left, will go back for deliberations. I've gone back and forth and compared myself just watching this trial to the Alex Murdaugh trial, but the jury in that case came up with a guilty verdict in less than 3 hours. So I am guessing that it's going to be around the same for there, maybe between 2 and 3 hours before we get a verdict. So it could happen tomorrow. So stay tuned to your phone if you're interested in hearing the verdict tomorrow.